Hello and a very warm welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausan Pereira. In what appears to be a relief for many states, the centre has said that it will borrow up to 1.1 trillion rupees, which is the estimated revenue shortfall on account of implementation of goods and services tax. The centre will then lend the money to the states under a special window. The extra fundraising was reflected in the borrowing calendar released by the RBI and the Finance Ministry. The centre borrowing on behalf of the states is likely to ensure that a single rate of borrowing is charged, and this would also be easy to administer. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the issue of GST compensation shortfall. Joining me on the program today are Shrikant, Baldi, former Chief Secretary, Himachal Pradesh. Also with me on the program today, A.K. Bhattacharya, Editorial Director of the Business Standard, and Charan Singh, CEO, EGROW Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Let me begin the program with you. It's been an interesting week really as far as GST issue of compensation and borrowing is concerned. You know, the 42nd GST Council meet took place and concluded a couple of days ago, after which the Finance Ministry addressed a press conference. There were a few finance ministers from some of the opposition ruled states were upset with what happened then. But now it seems like, everyone has accepted this decision of the centre borrowing the money and then passing it on to the states to address this issue of compensation shortfall.
Yes, I think, since the holding of the 42nd meeting of the GST Council on 8th of October, quite a few developments have taken place. Initially, there was this idea of rupees 68,000 crore of money to be given as a borrowing for the states. And then now we hear that the Finance Ministry and the RBI have agreed to taking 1.1 trillion rupees of borrowing and giving it to the states. Now, I think it's a good move because it resolves a contentious issue, at least for the time being. But we need to understand what has really happened. What has really happened is that the procedure of borrowing has been changed, in a sense that it is still not considered as central borrowing because it will not be reflected in the centre's fiscal deficit. It will be somewhat similar to centre borrowing for World Bank. Money comes in and then it is on lent to the states on a back-to-back loan basis. So from the centre's point of view, it does not reflect in centre's books. It will continue to reflect in the state's books, in a sense that the states will actually be responsible for repaying that money. So, but the procedure has been changed, and procedure has been changed for good reasons. Good reasons why? Because imagine a situation where 30 different states approaching the RBI and negotiating the borrowing terms, which would have played havoc with the bond market and the yields. So what the centre has done in good sense is that on behalf of the states, the centre will go out and borrow that 1.1 trillion rupees and on lend that money to the states. The centre's deficit will remain intact. The states will have to bear the burden of repaying it on the basis of the compensation cess that they will be able to levy beyond 2022 for another 2 years. That was the decision taken in October 8, 2020. Now, the critical question that is still not been resolved is whether the states, the borrowing limit will get enhanced, or this 1.1 trillion rupees, which is being on lent to the states, will be treated as additional borrowing, or whether they will be counted as part of the enhanced 5% of GDP borrowing limit or not. That is something the states have demanded. To recap, the states had asked for two things. One, that the center must borrow, and the second, that the borrowing that happens should be an additional borrowing. And it is only after these two conditions are met, the states, the opposition ruled states had said that we will decide on how much money to be borrowed and all that. Now it seems that what has been decided is the procedure of borrowing has been settled, that the center will borrow it to keep the bond rate intact. Bond rates have actually reacted a little bit. In a sense, the yields have gone up marginally, but it has not really gone out of tune, seeing that the center will borrow it in one go.
Sure.
And the second thing is whether the borrowing it will be treated as extra borrowing or within the existing borrowing is something on which the jury is still out.
Absolutely. All right. So, Mr. Baldi, I'd like to bring you into the picture now. So, how does this really help the states? What do the states get out of this? And does it make life a little easier for the states?
Thank you very much for inviting me. As you know, yesterday evening, the government of India has taken a very important decision that they will be borrowing in place of the states asking to borrow in case of option 1, which they had provided in the 41st meeting of the GST Council. So it's a very welcome move. And I think, as Mr. Bhattacharya mentioned, this removes a big irritant between the states and the central government as far as how the GST compensation is to be collected, whether the states are to borrow or the central government is to borrow. Once the central government has decided, I think this is a great relief to the states, because the GSEC rate as far as the central government is always lower by 50-60 basis point compared to the states. So this would be very, very good thing, and it would be a uniform rate of thing. And anyway, whatever interest and loan is to be paid is to be repaid from the GST compensation fund. So no burden comes on any state government as far as this loan taking is concerned. The second point which Mr. Bhattacharya was mentioning about the additional borrowing, what I have gathered from talking with my counterparts who deal with this matter in the GST, that this will be additional borrowing. The yesterday's communication also makes it clear that this would be in addition to 3% plus the additional Bharat, Atmanirbhar borrowing which has been allowed by the government of India. So this would be additional borrowing, and so this is a great relief. And I think the GST Council will be moving in the right perspective of federalism, of consensus, which will now emerge from this.
All right. Okay, points taken. I think we've clarified a few aspects there as far as these particular issues are concerned. Bringing Professor Charan Singh into the picture now. Professor, how do you look at all of these things? You know, initially we saw that the center wanted the states to borrow. There were certain states who threatened to take the center to court really as far as this particular issue is concerned. And now we see that the center has decided to borrow, 1.1 trillion rupees. And this is going to address several of the other issues like the two other panelists have mentioned as well. You know, this issue of a single rate of borrowing and many such factors.
Actually, this has been a long debate, and it was rightly pointed out by my two other colleagues that this issue has been raking up for a couple of weeks now. Fiscal issues are not very easy to handle. If you look at the example of Maastricht Treaty, which brought Europe together, fiscal issues were very waxed, and they could decide on only two indicators: gross fiscal deficit, and under the Maastricht Treaty had to be 3%, and debt to GDP ratio had to be 60%. The fiscal pillar, they have still not been able to firm up. So fiscal issues are always very complex, and the way it has all panned out, I think has panned out very well. In the true federal structure, in the true federal spirit. This has been discussed back and forth, some states opposing it, the central government making their own position very clear initially, and finally yesterday conceding, saying, okay, we can go ahead and do this. This is the new way. Now you're right, the fiscal deficit of the central government will not get impacted. The borrowing is going to be done by the state. This is an additional borrowing, so it does not impact the regular borrowing calendar of the state governments. So all this is very perfect. The issue that I have in mind is that these sort of vexed issues on fiscal are going to come regularly and many times even hereafter. That is one. The other, given the situation that we were in or that we are passing through COVID, where the whole world acknowledges that this issue is not going to get resolved very soon and that this may take at least 2 more years to come back to normalcy, that is 2022. And there are estimates, if you had heard the debate yesterday, which happened on CNBC, where the MD of the IMF and President of ECB and the Finance Minister of Indonesia, they were all debating together. There is a worry that normalcy may take about 2025. So this is the situation. This sort of a situation that happened in India in GST is not just once. It's going to happen again. It may happen next year or it may happen early. Now, what is a long-term solution to this? That is the key issue. Now, we have just resolved it this present time, but in the long term, we have to think through under this true spirit of federalism, how are we going to resolve it? According to me, this is the right time when we need a permanent fiscal commission. Like you have a monetary authority, which is a permanent monetary authority. You have appointed some independent thinkers on which you call the MPC on the monetary authority. You similarly need now a permanent fiscal body which should be able to take care of these issues. The other thing, just imagine the amount of borrowing that is going to shoot up. This way or that way doesn't matter. 50-year bonds or now the GST bonds doesn't matter. The amount of borrowings that are going to shoot up, they have to come from the same market. And therefore, I think a time has come now to consider separating debt from monetary management.
Right.
There has to be a debt management authority which focuses on how much is being borrowed, at what rates they are being borrowed, what is the tenor under which they are being borrowed. You must have heard this term, the borrowing calendar. This is very important. It impacts the yield curve because the borrowing calendar not only decides the timings, it also decides the volume. And therefore, these issues are really very perplexed. And I think for the first time, we faced it and we have done it heroically. The central government has agreed to it. But for the future, we have to start thinking. And these are the two suggestions that I am making.
Absolutely. All right. Points taken. I think there are some valid suggestions and they need to be looked into. Mr. Bhattacharya, talking about how these kind of issues are going to persist, because in the past as well, we've seen similar kind of issues cropping up as far as compensation is concerned, and they've been addressed from time to time. The GST Council itself has a dispute mechanism built in too. So probably we can talk about that as well and how important it is.
Well, you have hit the nail on the head. In a sense that having resolved this issue in a certain way, we need to draw the right lessons because this is not going to be the last problem that the states and the center will have to deal with the next few years over GST. Number one, I would say is this, that the GST Council as a body needs to reclaim its relevance. My sense is the last couple of weeks' developments showed us that GST Council probably was not becoming the kind of a forum where these issues should be settled and discussed. Unfortunately, the proposals of the government came outside the forum of the GST Council. It did not come within the GST Council format. In my view, if you want to strengthen institutional mechanisms to resolve the GST issues, then they should be discussed in the GST Council, and for which this council is the most important and most relevant body. And these issues coming forward should be discussed in GST Council, and that probably is a good lesson to take from these developments in the last few weeks. The second point is the states must also become a little more practical and pragmatic. they must realize that the 14% annual growth rate in revenues is a little impractical in a post-COVID scenario. They must acknowledge that if COVID has taken place, then they must not insist on a 14% revenue growth from the next few years, because that is at least till 2022. So that is something that must be discussed, and the states must be pragmatic and generous and come forward to the center and say that compensation mechanism should be retained, but a 14% growth rate is something, as it is in 2017, my view was that 14% rate is a bit too generous promise that the center has made. So I think the time has come now, is the appropriate time for the states to show that statesman-like approach and tell the center that if you have been able to help my borrowing problem, then I am going to come forward and say that 14% growth rate is impractical, and let us settle for deciding on the compensation. Let us agree on a 10% growth rate or 11% growth rate, whatever that be. But the forum for that should be GST Council. We need to strengthen GST Council and not weaken it. My fear is that if GST Council is weakened, then the future of GST will also be affected. And my final point is that the dispute resolution mechanism that you referred to is hinted at in GST Council, but I don't think that the GST Council mechanism, the structure, is outlined. We should not be living in a world where we should be scared of dealing with disputes. Whether there are differences or whether there are disputes, we must be bold enough to deal with disputes, and a mechanism in GST Council framework, if it is created, it will be good. Apparently, the GST Council Act had talked about the dispute mechanism, but did not create a kind of a commission or a kind of a body that should deal with disputes. So I think a time has come to settle this issue once and for all, so that in future, if any such issues come up, the states and the center can refer that issue to the dispute settlement body.
Absolutely. All right. So, Mr. Baldi, as far as long-term solutions are concerned, let's hear your views as well. We heard what the professor had to say. We heard what Mr. Bhattacharya had to say, that, more power needs to be given to the council itself, and the council needs to be far more relevant. What are your thoughts really on the best way forward as far as dealing with this and coming out with a short or a long-term solution?
I have been fortunate attending some of the meetings where these decisions were taken by the GST Council. I was finance secretary that time. And the points which has been raised by the other two panelists are very, very important. There has to be some way where the future disputes are resolved in an amicable manner. The issue of having a separate dispute resolution body was discussed in many GST Council meetings. And it was also discussed when we were having the constitutional amendment. Actually, the earlier constitutional amendment draft had some provision of dispute resolution, which was not made part of the 101st dispute, constitutional amendment. The reason which was cited was that if we see the GST Council, it is headed by the Union Finance Minister, and it has all the state finance ministers as members. It is one of the highest body, and it has been empowered to take all the fiscal decisions pertaining to GST. So the council felt that if we have a separate dispute resolution, we are making a super body which is going to decide the sovereign functions like taxations. Once we have a dispute resolution body, it is not limited to a dispute like this, which was a vexed dispute between the state and center. Suppose the GST Council decides some tax rates. The dispute body can go and say that whether this tax rate is right or wrong. So the GST Council, I think, rightly decided that there should not be a separate dispute resolution body, and it was not made part of the GST Act and the Constitutional Amendment Act. But I think Professor Charan Singh is right that we should have a system, and as Mr. Bhattacharya has mentioned, there should be a system within the GST Council where we, whenever any vexed issue like this comes up, how this is to be resolved, there has to be a system where, in the true spirit of the federal system, where the states as well as the center meets and decide this. As on today, the system is that this is deliberated in the GST Council, and most of the issues are decided by consensus or this. At the same time, if there is a difficult decision, there is a provision of voting, and if there is a voting by 3/4 of the votes, then this can be passed. But any such decision where the states are, having a different opinion, it is better to decide by consensus or by having a mechanism within the GST Council to decide such issues. And that would be the right way in the true spirit of the federalism. I think the yesterday's decision is also in consonance with this, and the GST Council could work together on many issues. And the GST framework itself, the way it has been implemented itself shows that center and states have been able to come together. They could cede their power of taxation, merge that, and have been working together very well from last 2 to 3 years.
Right. Okay, points taken. I think those were some very valid points as well. I'm going to go back to a point that Mr. Bhattacharya was making and take that up with you, Professor Charan Singh. I thought it was a very pertinent point that he raised about, how the states also at some level need to be practical and flexible, because, we all know that we are in the midst of a pandemic, and you can't, say even right now that you want your 14% of compensation. Maybe it's time to, give and take a little bit.
So, I am a professor of economics, and game theory plays a very important role in economics. Even the auction, which has just won the Nobel Prize, you'll see the game theory playing out in even that. So that's on top of my mind since the last few days. Now, as a professor, I can tell you one thing: expenditure management in such crucial times is going to become difficult. So we cannot go for expenditure compression. Now, the GST, obviously, because business is down and all over the world, the collections are going to suffer. 14% escalation annually or incremental is almost going to become impossible. In such a situation, I had two thoughts. One of it was, we can tell the local bodies which have been empowered 2 decades ago under special constitutional amendment to also start borrowing. I do not know why they are not being invoked and asked to borrow. At the end of the day, Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, Baroda Municipal Corporation, Bangalore Municipal Corporation, Hyderabad Municipal Corporation, Chennai, Kolkata, name it, there are quite a few of them. They can borrow on their own, and so that expenditure compression doesn't take place in case there is a restraint or there is constraint at the state level budget or at the central level budget. The advantage of permitting the local bodies to borrow is because they are so close to the ground level. Whatever they borrow and whatever activities on which they borrow will be seen by the people, and therefore the borrowing will be very successful. That is one. The other is little complex, and that goes from the game theory. In this whole episode that has played out, 10 states were opposing it, and these 10 states happen to be in the opposition. Now, as a professor, totally neutral, looking from the economic angle, this was a little worrisome for me as it was playing out. It could be game theory. Can we think, and I have two very good panelists with me, can we think of incentivizing the states to ensure better compliance to GST collection? And if that, and the responsibility is shared by the states, and they know how difficult it is, probably this sort of posturing that happened for the last 8 to 10 days would not have happened. Now, I'm not worried about posturing. As I initially in my remarks mentioned, under the Maastricht Treaty, the fiscal pillar was the most difficult. Bringing so many states together to think together similarly on a fiscal pillar is not easy. But now, after this whole episode, when 14% was conceived and framed constitutionally, it was expected to be normal times.
Right.
This is once in a century that has happened. This is not a normal time. So, continuing to emphasize that I should get 14% compensation, I think was little too harsh. and not appropriate.
Right.
So therefore, I totally agree with Mr. Bhattacharya. States have to be more prudent and pragmatic, and they have to think how they can accommodate. And in that direction, I am making two suggestions. Ensure local bodies borrow more, and also find a way, incentivize the states, make them equally responsible or more responsible for GST tax collection.
I would like to add
Yeah,
a
please
point
go
on
ahead.
14%.
Yeah, I'm going to get concluding remarks from all the panelists. You can start, Mr. Baldi, first with yours.
Yeah, I would like to give a genesis of 14% increase. I was part of the GST Council meeting. You know, when the GST was being implemented, all the states had different point of views. You know, some states had the purchase tax like Punjab. Many manufacturing states had CST as origin tax. So they were losing a revenue which was not being subsumed or which was not going to get to be received by them after GST, because GST is a destination tax. So because of these fears, they wanted a protection of the revenue for a certain period, and it was agreed it should be 5 years. It's very correct, as Mr. Bhattacharya has mentioned, that it is 14%, and it is a liberal, considering it is compounding one. But it is 5 years, and it is not being extended at all. So it is limited to 5 years, and this has been given by the GST Compulsion to State Act 2017, and it cannot be changed. So the center has also agreed, the states have also agreed. Now it's a matter of 1.5 years till June 2022. This is going to be there. Now, whatever we are talking about, the loan is to be repaid from the cess which is going to be received after 1st July 2022.
Right.
So the 14% is not an issue because it is going to be over on June 2022. Whatever is the cess which will be collected after then will be, you know, first charge would be on the interest, then would be on area, and then will be on the principal repayment. And rest, whatever comes, could be distributed between the state and center at 50-50%. So the key issue is that we had a specific fall in the current year. But if we see the last year also, there was a gap of 70,000 crore. Only
Right.
in 17, 18 and 18, 19, we didn't have a shortfall. It was a surplus. So the key issue is that this year also, if we see in objective manner, what we are giving 1.1 lakh crore is option 1. That is a loss due to the normal implementation of GST. It is
Right.
not big, and the 7% increase has been taken, and the gap is being given. If we take the total gap of 14%, then it is 2.3 lakh crore, which now that option 2 has been removed, and that compensation will be given after June 2022. Apart from 1.1 lakh, that gap will be around 1.2 lakh crore. So the 14% is not an issue. The key issue is that how do we promote the economy that there is no shortfall in the cess in future, and the state and center should work together to give a boost to the GDP.
Right.
And if that happens, these issues will not come. The key issue is that even the last year also we had a shortfall. And this year, obviously, because of the pandemic, we have a shortfall. Now the state and center should work together to improve and see the way out where the GDP improves and our tax collection improves.
Absolutely. Okay, all right. On that note, then I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective. For us, what's coming out of this discussion is that the issue of procedure of borrowing has been settled. The center borrowing the shortfall is a welcome move. This will ensure a single rate of borrowing, thereby simplifying the entire process. These kind of issues are going to persist and going to continue in the near future as well. And for the time being, one particular issue has been resolved. What we need to do is find a long-term solution. The GST Council as a body needs to regain its relevance. All aspects related to GST must be resolved within the framework of the council itself. The states on their part must be practical and flexible. They need to adapt with the times and be open to change. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.